Lucy Parsons, a woman of will. So, this is about a woman by the name of Lucy Parsons. And since this is May, this is about the May uprisings. So, I've looked at several videos and, a lot of the ignorance that's out there. Apparently, there are some people that believe that African Americans cannot be a mixture of Native American and Mexican ancestries and, other ethnicities, which is totally false. And I have also talked about people that are in my family that are a partly Native American. And even though we are still, we're Black people, but we have a mixture of Native American in my family tree, and I don't deny that. And also, there are some people that are not only from the South, that are also from islands, and there are also people that are from Latin culture, and also Cuban as well. And so there are a lot of ignorance out there in the world where people think with a one track view of seeing people. They view people by skin color, not really knowing that just because a person's a particular skin color doesn't mean that's only who they are. That they don't see that people can be half of something else, or a multiple of other ethnicities in their family. And, if they see someone, they base you on your eye color, your hair textures, your skin color, and not really knowing that the person could have a white parent, or they could have a Native American parent or grandparent, or they could have maybe aunts and uncles that are Mexican, but their parents, might be half Black, half Mexican, or half Latino, or something like that. So I've seen some of the videos. Have been really, 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 really. I think a lot of it is because, like sort of like Kanye, people don't read. They just refuse to read. And so here's an important thing that happened in history about industrial workers of the world. A union for all workers, and a woman by the name of Lucy Parsons, a woman of will. Okay, let's take a look at a little bit into the life of this woman. So, in women's history, for almost 70 years, Lucy Parsons, she fought for the rights of poor and disenfranchised people in the face of the increasing oppressive industrial economic system. So Lucy's radical activism challenged the racist and sexist sentiment in a time when even radical Americans believed that a woman's place was in the home. So this woman was a feminist. She wasn't against males, but she fought for poor and disenfranchised people. And so she was a very strong person in history. In her early life, little did they know. Now, this is for all the people who think that Black people can't have Native American in their family. In her early life, Lucy Parsons, she had an African American, Native American, and Mexican ancestry. She was born in Texas around 1853 and during the Civil War era, and it is likely that her parents were also slaves. During her lifetime, in order to disguise her racial origins in a prejudiced society, Lucy went under many surnames. She often went by Lucy Gonzalez, denying her African American roots while claiming her Mexican heritage as the cause of her dark skin tone. So even in history, you have on record people who have done this, who they may have African American ancestors' roots, but they also are very much a part of the Native American ancestry as well. They have people in their family that are from that as well. So I've seen some crazy videos where people are saying no African people have Native American. There's no such thing. There's no such thing that blacks mix with the Native American. That is bullshit. Okay, and I said it. Yes. So around 1870, while living with a former slave named Oliver Gathings, Lucy met Albert Parsons, who would soon become her husband. Their marriage, however, was probably not legal since miscegenation laws forbidding marriage and cohabiting between white people and members of other races prevented interracial marriages at the time. So in 1872, while the South was instituting repressive Jim Crow segregation laws, Lucy and Albert were forced to leave Texas due to their political involvements. Albert had worked diligently on registering Black voters and was shot in the leg and threatened with lynching. So he and Lucy also felt threatened because their interracial marriage. Lucy and Albert arrived in Chicago in 1873 as a printer for the Chicago Times. And this was a difficult time for working people all over the nation, especially industrial cities like Chicago at the time. So because the country had fallen into a depression, leaving millions of people unemployed, the passing of the contract labor law in 1864 allowed American businesses to contract and bring in immigrant laborers. A large unskilled pool of workers grew in Chicago, which drove wages down. The laboring population, however, was being radicalized by the introduction of socialist and anarchist ideology to the US. So, inspirations and actions. In the summer of 1877, one of the greatest mass strikes in US history took place in response to the Depression. Rail workers all over the country joined the railroad. In July, the strike moved to Chicago, where rail workers waged a militant battle. They derailed erratic battles with the police who attempted to disperse the very unfamiliar with what's going on today. So Albert addressed crowds of up to 25,000 people to promote peaceful ways of negotiating. This helped to bring him into the forefront of the anarchist movement in Chicago. So because of the involvement of organizing workers, Albert was fired from his job at the Times and blacklisted in Chicago's printing trade. So Lucy opened up a dress shop to support her family, and with her friend Lizzie Swank, hosted meetings for the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, which is abbreviated ILGWU. Lucy found herself juggling her career as well as her political work, which was becoming more and more involved. So Lucy began to write for many radical publications, including the Socialist and the Alarm and Anarchist Weekly, published by the International Working People's Association, which she and Albert had helped in 1883. She had little sympathy for bosses who were paying their workers standard wages. Her most famous article was Two Tramps, advocating propaganda by the deed, a philosophy that held that only Violent direct action or the threat of such action will ultimately win the demands of the workers. So she was often considered more dangerous than her husband because she was outspoken in her beliefs and the rights of the poor. So Lucy was also threatened as a militant and radical woman. Okay. She was looked at as being threatening to the people who were against her speaking out. So the people who refused to assume the role of, or people who refused her, she refused to assume a role of just being a homemaker. So she was very outspoken, very strong woman. And I would believe this is more of a feminist mentality for her to be very outspoken and to speak out on her beliefs in terms of poor and disenfranchised people. So May uprisings by 1886, it was becoming exceedingly difficult to keep the lid on the kettle, so to speak. So people across the country were boiling up in resistance. Sounds very familiar to their working conditions and the squelching of their union activities by authorities. Across the US, people were calling for 8 work day or 8-hour workday, proclaiming whether you work by the piece or work by the day. Decreasing the hours, increasing your pay. May 1st was chosen as the date to kick off the official movement for the 8-hour day. So the strategy was this: workers would demand 8-hour work, 8 hours of work with no cut in pay. And if this was received with opposition, they would strike. So as a result, 350,000 workers across the nation walked off their jobs to participate in a mass general strike. 40,000 workers struck in Chicago, creating a whirlwind of radical activity and convincing prominent radical leaders such as Lucy Parsons that the country was ready for a mass workers' revolution. So on May 3rd, a strike at McCormick's Harvest Works in Chicago became violent as police fired into the crowd of unarmed strikers. Many strikers were wounded and 4 were killed. Reacting to the events, radicals called a meeting in Haymarket Square to discuss the situation. So the peaceful meetings was disrupted by police, and unknown figure threw, or a person, they don't even know who, threw a bomb or firebomb, killing one of the officers. And one of the worst violent violations of the U.S. civil rights occurred over the next 5 days. So as police swept the town looking for any of all of the anarchists and radicals, although he was not even at the Haymarket Square that day, Albert was one of the 8 men accused of the bombings. So they didn't even know if he did it or not, but he was swept up in that raid. So he went into hiding until the first trial date, at which point he walked into the court to turn himself in and sit with the comrades. So during this period, Lucy was under constant surveillance by the police. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? So she was arrested under the slightest suspicion that she knew the whereabouts of her husband. Although authorities looked upon Lucy as a threat to the status quo, she was never charged with a conspiracy in the bombing. So the rationale of the authorities was that the chances of the woman being convicted of murder and receiving the death penalty were too slim. And if the woman were to stand in trial with the men, it would decrease the chance of the men receiving such a harsh conviction. So women were not allowed to be capable of such radical and militant action. And so they believed. So the Haymarket affair. So the movement of the 8-hour workday was one of the most difficult struggles of the laboring people in the U.S. It is filled with stories of huge protests which were broken up by police and Pinkertons, private securities, is what they call them. Many people were maimed and killed before demands to shorten the workday were finally met. So one of the most famous events in history of the 8-hour struggle was the Haymarket affair. in response to a huge protest at a mill in Chicago, in which a few workers were killed by police. Local radical activists organized a meeting at the Haymarket Square in the downtown of Chicago. Over 2,000 people showed up to hear the speakers. And so even the mayor of Chicago appeared and reported that the event was peaceful. And however, the mayor left the meeting and numbers dwindled, and a huge army of police marched toward the crowd and gave them an order to disperse. So during the confusion, an unknown person threw this firebomb in the crowd of the police, killing that officer, and the riot had broke out, in which both workers and police were injured and killed. So the days that followed were bleak, as nearly every anarchist and socialist in the town was arrested and detained. So many radical anarchist papers were illegally shut down. And homes, meetings, halls, and officers where outspoken supporters an 8-hour movement lived and did political work were raided without any warrants. So Oscar Neebe, Adolph Fischer, August Spies, Louis Ling, and Michael Schwab, Samuel Fielding, Carl Engel, and Lucy Parsons' husband, Albert Parsons, were scapegoats for the riot and brought to trial, even though many of the men were not at the Haymarket Square at the time of the melee. So with a jury of 12 men who were actively opposed to the radicalism, the defeats were found guilty, okay, or the defendants, rather. So after the appeals, 4 of the men were sentenced and hanged. 3 were given lengthy prison sentences, and 1 committed suicide while in his cell. So the Haymarket affair influenced many prominent anarchists, including Emma Goldman and Voltairine de Cleyre. It also serves as a reminder of the difficulties involved in 8-hour struggles, as well as the need to remain vigilant and not allow these gains to wither away. So don't mourn, organize, it says. After Albert turned himself into the police, the trial proceeded in October of 1887, a lengthy trial wrought with injustices. The men were sentenced to death by hanging. However, eventually, 1 man committed suicide while in prison, and 2 were given life sentences, and 1 received 15 years imprisonment in an appeal. So Lucy, stricken with both anger and pride that her husband would die for his beliefs in anarchism, headed a campaign for clemency. So she toured the country, distributing information about the unjust trial and gatherings of funds. So everywhere she went, Lucy was greeted by the armed police, who barred her entrance into the halls. So they tried to block her way. So in her hard attempts to save the lives of the convicted men, Lucy was confronted. Listen to that. Even though she was a very outspoken woman and she had all the strength of what feminists would do in this case, she was in defense of her husband and of the males that were being convicted of this unfair, unjust system here. So again, it reads, in her hard attempts to save the lives of the convicted men, Lucy confronted another battle, this one within the labor market's own ranks. So the leadership of the Knights of Labor, the group to which she belonged for 10 years, took a long stand against the Haymarket activists. So Terence Powderly, the leader of the Knights, took a passive approach to the liberal struggle of the time. So he opposed strikes, often discouraging members of his own group from using those means of obtaining their demands. So in addition, he was strongly opposed to the growing trends towards radicalism. So Powderly stood against the Haymarket defendants with the belief that the government should make an example of them. So although she found herself without support from the Knights, Lucy continued speaking, and her speaking tours gaining more and more people's interest in the Haymarket case and making a big name for herself. So in her efforts, however, it did not sway the courts and the governor of Illinois, who was under political pressure to execute the men, although all the evidence against them had been circumstantial. So 4 men were executed November 11th of 1887, and Lucy brought her 2 children to see the father one last time, but she was arrested along with the kids, taken to jail, forced to strip, left naked with her children in a cold cell until hanging of her husband was over. So in tears upon her release, she vowed to continue to fight injustice, even though her husband had been killed, and she feared the same fate for herself. So after the execution, Lucy lived in poverty, receiving $8 a week from a Pioneer Aid and a Support Association, a group formed to support the families of the Haymarket martyrs, which she was definitely one, and others deprived of support because of the working for labor interest. So the new struggles were soon Lucy's affiliations within the labor struggle changed again as different factions in the movement arose in response to the upcoming elections in 1890. Many opted to organize for the reformative measures and to support the Democratic Party, swaying the vote of the workers in this direction. And so Lucy vehemently opposed the new emphasis, feeling that reform would weaken the movement and the collaboration with oppressive parties. That would mean doom for the independent labor parties after their success in the 1887 elections. So she held an an uncompromising syndicalist position that envisioned a voluntary association of workers supporting and enforcing a common regulations. So her political perspective was firmly based in class consciousness. So she identified a class of hierarchy as the pivotal problem of the oppressive system of her time, which is still the same way today. Believe me, it really is. We have a lot of issues around race, surrounding class, the haves, the have-nots, people who are wealthier or wealthiest, people who are poor, poorer, or the working class poor. So it has really not changed very much. It's just new people involved in it now. And it's, named differently, but it's still the same stuff. So she identified a class of hierarchy and pivotal problems in the oppressive system of her time. So because of this, she was scoffed at and reform measures and scoffed at the reform measures within the existing government, where the rich still lorded over the working class, which is like what I said, similar to what's happening today. And in 1888 and 18 through 1889, economic forms called by the city of Chicago exemplified the new liberal reformist tendencies. So, though they attempted to address labor issues by allowing representatives from labor and business to meet, Lucy continued to question the critique these measures as not enough because they still preserve this society's system of class segregation. Yeah, this is very, very familiar as to what's going on right now. And so it goes on and on and on and on and on. So it talks about the later communist work. It talks about even the industrial workers of the world. It goes on to talk about the rifts within the movements and Lucy's relationship to the anarchist movement that had always been vague. And then it goes on to go further down in the reading of Scottsboro trial. And I will skip down to that. So in the spring of 1931, 8 young African-American men and boys were hoboing a train to Memphis, trying to find work in the depression-torn South. So on this ride, they were accused of raping 2 white women who were on the train. So the young men from ages 13 on up were put into jail in Scottsboro, Alabama to wait a trial. And so they were ultimately found guilty of the rape and were sentenced to death. So the trial and conviction of the Scottsboro 8, which is historical, would have been or would have all but been forgotten if not for the clemency campaign initiated by the International Labor Defense, which is abbreviated ILD. So, of the Communist Party, a group to which Lucy Parsons dedicated much of her energy. Okay, so she was also a part of this as well, which is very much historical thing. So, the ILD's clemency campaign of Scottsboro 8 was the first time racism was openly challenged in the U.S. courts. So, the ILD was able to launch an effective campaign in support of the young men. And one of the women accusers even recanted her testimony, thus dismissing the bulk of the incriminating evidence. Eventually, the death penalty was dropped. And for the defendants, however, it was only a partial victory, that as they still served lengthy prison sentences for the crime which they did not commit. The main victory of the case can be seen on a larger level in the terms of how it affected racism in this country. The members of the Ku Klux Klan, at a high in the 1920s, dipped drastically in the 1930s, and also to some extent capital punishment against African Americans was used less frequently than it had been in the past. So the Scottsboro and the ILD helped pave the road for the civil rights movement nearly 3 decades later, and served as an inspiration for activists for the generations to come. And so I am not going to really, I guess I'll read this small snippet right here, because Lucy's death and a continuing struggle of free speech, which we're all talking about, free thinkers and free speech, even her eyesight with it failing, Lucy Parsons was active in the fight against oppression until her death. So continuing to inspire crowds, she spoke at International Harvester in February of 1941, and one of her last major appearances, an accidental fire killed her on March 7, 1942, at the age of 89. And so her lover, George Markstall, died the next day from wounds he received while trying to save her. So to add to this tragedy, Lucy's library of 1,500 books on sex, socialism, and anarchy were mysteriously stolen, along with all of her personal papers. So neither the FBI nor the Chicago police told Irving Abrams, who had come to the rescue, or who to rescue the library, and that the FBI had already confiscated all her books. So the struggle for fundamental freedom of speech, in which Lucy had engaged throughout her life, continued through her death, as authorities still tried to silence this radical woman by robbing her of her work for her of her life, of her lifetime. So though she was affiliated herself with many different groups throughout her lifetime, Lucy Parsons was strong in politics. Beliefs remained distinctly individual and uncompromising, and she never sought less than revolution to change the oppressive capitalist system surrounding her. So working with a clear focus from the perspective of a class consciousness, Lucy's fought with the workers first, seeing issues of sex and race as intertwined with a larger struggle. So because she was a woman of action and strong words, the establishment tried to repress her individual voice, often relegating her to merely the role of a bereaved widow. Yet the legacy of her 70 years of fighting stay with us to inspire us on our similar struggles today. So that's actually at the end. So I skipped sort of towards the end. So there's a little more in here that I didn't talk about. I talked about her working and her newly formed Communist Party, and also situations where the establishment charged African American organizers with crime that they did not commit. So if you want to read this, it should not be far reaching. So it's in Industrial Workers of the World. So if you look for that and look for what her name is under Lucy Parsons, the Woman of Will, it will tell you about it. Talks a lot about incarcerated workers, General Defense Committee, Gender Equity Committee. It talks a lot about the things that have to do with the workers of the world. So it's IWW is what it's entitled, the industrial workers of the world. So all those people that are out there doing these videos saying that there's no such thing as African and Black people mixed with Native American. Well, here's a woman right here who was in history, and despite what these people who never read anything are saying, yes, and she's not the only one, I'm one. And so you have people that were even telling me they don't know anybody in my family. They were like, you're not from Native America. Black people are from, you know. And so I'm like sitting up there laughing a little bit because if you look at the pictures of this woman and you really take a good gander of how many people have not seen women that look like this. You know, you look at her one time, she's like, she looks like she could be Mexican. She looks Black. You know, there are a lot of people walking around looking like this. So how could you not see this? How could you not understand that there are people that have different nationalities in their family? It's just, especially today with all the interracial coupling we've got, of course. But, you know, even back then, you see the struggles she went through. I just read through it that she tried to hide her identity, part of her identity, because of the racism that happened back then. So yes, there were people that even back then, there were people of mixed heritages. So some of the people you see today are a part of that, have great uncles and aunts and great great grandparents that were half Mexican, whatever, Latin, Native American, and they're Black. So why would you not see that? You know, that is just so ignorant. And some of us are, most Black people, there's most of us that don't want to admit it. We have European people. It may not be the best history for some people, but some of us have European ancestors as well. So there's no such thing as a person being of only one. Maybe if you look, you can see there's more of something than the others that is undetectable. You cannot really see with the naked eye. But if you really research and you really read about all these things, yes, it is possible. There is not anything impossible. So I just wanted to reiterate that that's what this video is about. This extraordinary woman, Lucy Parsons, and she married a guy named Albert Parsons, and I actually looked him up as well. So we already kind of read what happened with him. She was married to this man right here. So I'm going to pull his face up. Now this is Albert Parsons. This was her late husband right here. And so it's just crazy that people don't understand. They don't read anything. And it's right before you, people. What is wrong with you? You don't even have to have books really nowadays. They have stuff all over the place where you can research and look things up. Stop this. That's what we're dealing with right now. People who refuse to read about what kinds of things go on in the world that have happened before you came here. And that's the reason why things are shaped the way they are. And when you say ignorant things like that in the public eye, people begin to not trust you. They begin to think, you know, something must be wrong with this individual. You know, something's wrong. They're not. And some people have admittedly said they don't read. So with that, saying that you don't read anything, you have no business saying things that you don't even know anything about. You don't know anything about it. And then if you do know something about it and you're saying it because you're trying to throw people under the bus, you're trying to benefit off the struggles of your people, you're trying to put them in a bad light so that you can come up and make some money. Shame on you. Shame on you to do that, knowing you know that what you're saying is wrong. But you're doing it because you think it's going to get you more views, it's going to get you more, you're going to get more publicity, which it does work. It's not good publicity, it's negative, but still, it's like, why would you do that? Why? Why? People are not going to trust you. They're not going to want to patronize, and they're not going to want to buy anything from you. They're not going to trust you, period. And so this is what we've got today. I have never seen so much foolishness, never, than more recently what I've seen on, TMZ, all this crazy stuff. Some of the stuff, what's scary is it's true. You want these things to be like not true, like no, he didn't say that, or this is not happening. This situation time, but it's true. That's what's scary. It's true. And so Kanye is not the only one out there that doesn't read. I've learned this just from watching some of the things and listening to some of the stuff that some of the younger people are saying. There's no such thing. That is just the craziest thing I've ever heard. There's no such thing. Right away, if you look at the history of enslavement, how people were raped, and you even talk about it. I've heard people talk about it. There's the house, slave, and then there's the field slave. And what was the criterions of the house slave people? Usually they were the lighter skin. Why was that? Because somebody was intermixing. They were getting slave women pregnant. How was it? Because the master was having intercourse with these slave women. And what happened? The offsprings. And this is what a lot of us come from. And people don't want to talk about it. It's not a great thing, but some of us might look more, like we may be of a mixed, background than others. Some you can't see it with the naked eye. Some know. Some know they're people. Others don't because of all of the diaspora, all of the different things, people being displaced everywhere. Some know their Native American roots or who their Latin roots are from. Because, it wasn't just white people that had slave ships, supposedly. There were also Latin countries that had slave masters. And so what do you think they were doing? So some of us are from that, and, how could you be so ignorant? How could you be so ignorant? That comes from not reading anything and not researching history and not really carefully thinking clear. And so anybody that's saying, even white people got to be careful. There's no such thing as I'm only one this. I'm only one of this and one of that. I had a roommate, nobody knew it. She showed a photo of her father. She had blonde hair all the way down to like just before her where she sits. And, she listened to heavy metal music and she was really friendly, and at the time I was in a dorm, school dorm. And, that this was during the 92. And people wanted to, get mad and they were talking about all of the problems, the social problems then. And so little did they know, they assumed that this girl was only white. And she revealed who her father was. and nobody knew it. But there were certain things about her features, if you really paid attention, that were just very strong features that had somewhat of an Afrocentric look about it. But it was really difficult because she's very thin. She had long blonde hair and she would dye her hair blonde. Her hair was actually like, she was like a messy, like what you call a messy brunette originally. But her sister took on more of the father's features. Now she took on more of her mother's features, which her mother was white, and her father was in fact African American. And so she felt comfortable showing me the photo as opposed to others who weren't very receiving. And so I saw the photo. I kind of knew. I had a feeling because there were certain things about her that to me I felt like she was a little bit more, you know, there was certain features about her like that she might be African, she might have some African descent in her, So I sensed it, but others just couldn't, she would be one you would say that could pass for white, completely white. If a white person saw her, they would think she was just white. That's how this girl looked. And so you can't really base what people have in their family tree just on looks alone. Okay? So for all of you who don't know any better and don't read about history and don't know, just looking at a person, you can't tell all of the people that are in their entire family tree. You cannot. Unless some people don't even know themselves. Some people, because of all of the displacement and people being thrown about every which way and not really knowing, and they can't really tell you everyone, some people themselves don't even know. But others, sometimes people will, like, I'll mention this one other individual as well. This one individual, if you saw this person, they appeared to be Latino. But he, in fact, said he was Creole. His family, all of them, they said every time they would approach him where he was, they would always approach him speaking Spanish. I knew this individual personally, so I won't tell you where, but if you saw him, you would have thought, oh, he's a Mexican man. But he said, no, I'm Black. I'm Creole, but I'm Black. Everybody in his family, when you look at them, some looked of darker skin. They looked like what you would think a typical African American would be, and then others didn't. Some looked like they were just full-blood Mexican or of Mexican Latin heritage. Others looked like they were just light-skinned African American. Then others looked like they were a mix of whatever. You couldn't tell. So you can never base on just looking at a person who all is in their family tree. And white people tend to do that a lot. And even Blacks will tend to do that. Well, they're Black, or that person is white, or that person can't have any Latin in there. There are Black people that were born and raised in Mexico. This is true. Some people don't even know that. Some people don't even know. If I was to just if I was just write right in here in Google, if I was just to say Black Mexicans, and guess what I would see? Because it exists, people. For those of you, it says Afro Mexicans. Black people erased from history. It talks about it in BBC, that there's a problem even within that country. More than 1 million people in Mexico are descended from African slaves, and the identity of Black and dark or Afro-Mexican, even if they don't look Black. It's there. There's a place, and I can't really say the name correctly, but it's Oaxaca. They are little known, and the community's leaders are now warning of possible radical steps to achieve official, probably notice, you know. Mexico finally recognizes its Black citizens because for a long time they weren't recognizing people there, people. There's no such thing as, oh, it's just one people there. And so don't let them come here and tell you that. It's bullshit. And so if you even look at this right here, if you click on it, if you even put Afro Mexican, they do exist. It's it's in the news. Who can't see this? Just because you see these kids, some people, even black people, are ignorant. Oh, they're Mexicans. They don't have any black in them. Yes, they do. More than 1 million people, it says, in Mexico are descended from African slaves. Beyond the southern state of Oaxaca, they are little known, and the community's leaders are now warning of possible radical steps to achieve official recognition. Okay, if you read more about this, stop this not reading stuff, people. What's wrong? Even the black people. Like, what is wrong with you? How come you don't read about anything? People that are the same as they have the same ancestors as you do. Their ancestors were slaves too. How could you be so ignorant? So anyway, with that being said, people really need to really read more. This is the lady right here, Lucy Parsons, Freedom, Equality, and Solidarity, Writings and Speeches from 1878 to 1937. This lady herself, she's a part of all of us. It's crazy. I just don't understand why people don't even read anything. You know, why would you do that? This is her. You haven't seen people that look like this. There's still people walking around look like this. And they say, I'm a black woman, but they have Native American roots. I have an aunt that looks just like this lady, hair all the way down past her buttocks. She is Cherokee. There's no way that people can be this ignorant and not know. But anyway, with that being said, I'm just taken back of all the ignorance that is out there, that people don't even read anything. With that being said, oh man, people, we need to do better. We need to do better at trying to educate ourselves. Like, comment, subscribe. Oh man. There's so much for people to learn. These young people, they need to really, really, really do some research. Read, people, read. We are more, don't you notice that when they have always these heated debates, it's always about the blacks and the Latinos? You don't notice that? Why is it that they lump the group with us? Because they're very much a part of us. So anyway, like, comment, subscribe. Thanks for listening.